I'm going to be talking today particularly around the work we've been doing in the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. This is a 5-year program that's in its 5th year at the moment. It's led by Tim Jackson at Surrey University, and alongside colleagues at Surrey, we've got others at Goldsmiths, Will Davies, and others at Anglia Ruskin, Leeds, Glasgow. And then at Middlesex University, where we're having a real focus looking at social enterprise. And what I really want to do is look at this idea of sustainable prosperity and how it allows us to rethink, what does it mean? What does progress mean? What does prosperity mean? And how social enterprises come in with a lot of very interesting answers to some of the big big and complex grand challenges that we've heard about over the last few days as well. So really, when we look at sustainable prosperity, we're asking, what can prosperity possibly look like in a world of social and environmental limits? So we're very much focused on looking at the climate emergency and the ecological emergency that we're facing the world, but actually ask, if we are going to live within the limits, our social and environmental limits, how can we actually live well? And that's where we see prosperity is the capabilities that people have to flourish, and this idea of flourishing, but while living within our limits. And that was a challenge that we set ourselves 5 years ago, to actually say, how can we live well within our limits? How can we actually have alternative forms? When we recognize the problems of the economic systems we're working within, we're living within, how can we actually find something that's an alternative? And that's where social enterprise came up as a crucial issue. And so I was running a stream of work that's looked at that. And over this talk, I'll touch on a number of the areas that we've been looking at. So one of the key things when looking at this agenda for sustainable prosperity is rethinking consumption. And recognizing that a lot of the ecological and environmental challenges come from our consumption patterns around the world, but also the assumption of endless economic growth. This that myth that we can continue growing our GDP and we can focus our progress on just measuring gross domestic product as a quite a crude economic measure, when actually that's not about living well. That's not about how do we, it doesn't help us have better lives, while it's also going to have the huge environmental costs in the future. What we set ourselves to ask is, how can we have more fun with less stuff? How can we actually live within those limits? And that raises questions when we're looking at more fun. What is the meaning of the good life? And related to that, what's the meaning of good work? And how do we see all of that in a way that can actually challenge some of the sort of the existing assumptions around growth? This links to sort of a wider agenda, which we call the sort of post-growth agenda. Beyond that obsession with growth, there's also a lot of research and work going on the idea of degrowth, which is very much linked to that. But we're recognizing with an international perspective that sometimes growth might be needed in some areas, while in other areas we need to be reducing our consumption and reducing our use of resources, which might require a sort of process of degrowth in those economies where that growth is dependent on enormous use of fossil fuels and having huge potential climate change impacts in the future. So if we're looking at this sort of the future, the question is, where might the future business models come from? And we've done a lot of work looking at the macroeconomic stability issue and economic models at a macro level, other colleagues in Surrey looking at that. But I was particularly interested in looking at what is the microeconomic viability, what's the role of enterprise in this post-growth economy. And for that, we're really interested in what are the types of businesses, but also what are the sectors that are conducive to us prospering? Where can we find ourselves living well? And I think I'll touch on some of these that we'll be looking at in the future. But there are particular sectors which we might say are not so conducive to sustainability, which might be related to those sectors with a heavy use of fossil fuels. But there are other sectors where they've been shown to have a huge benefit on well-being, on people living well, on happiness and well-being, while also having very much less impact on resource use. So this might be in sectors such as the care sectors, some of the leisure sectors, and things like that. So, sorry, I'll just turn on my camera. So we'll be looking at some of those issues. Also, we want to focus on those where we find the low resource use, so particular sectors like the circular economy, fair trade, as well. And if we look at all of these areas where we see a positive future of both living well and living within our limits, these are the areas where social enterprise have a long tradition. So it's an exciting area where social enterprises really come up with some opportunities for the future. So my talk will be divided into several sections. First of all, I'll look at the idea of multiple objectives for flourishing. Then we'll also look at the ideas of good work and work in the economy. And then thirdly, I'll be looking at how do we redefine some key terms related to the economy by taking this perspective of looking at from the perspective of the social enterprise models that have challenged the underlying profit maximizing business assumptions that some of the economy is been based on. So I think we heard this morning in the keynote from Anne-Claire how the importance of looking at multiple objectives. She particularly looked at the social welfare objective against the commercial or market logics. And I think here what we're looking at for in social enterprises and the work we've been doing, a large number of empirical studies, looking at those organizations that not only bring the social but also bring environmental logics together. So there's a lot of issues to do with well-being and social justice. A lot of those social enterprises we also have a strong environmental element to it as well. So a study we did looking at community businesses in health and well-being, we found many of them were actually looking at nature-based solutions because of their great health benefits, but also the environmental benefits, and also it was making a good commercial sense as well. So they were able to address all of that. So we found those sort of projects were particularly interesting for us. Also, as I mentioned before, we've done work looking at the whole area of different resource use and what sectors are particularly interesting. So I mentioned care already, the importance of care, and we've seen that in the last 5 months, the whole care sector, and we've recognised maybe the hidden costs in care and the hidden the hidden work that's going on, and how it's maybe underfunded in the past. We've also recognised the importance of leisure, particularly as we've had it leisure withdrawn from us through lockdown. We've had to find new ways of we're looking for the future of how do we bring in leisure in the future. But the leisure industries can become ones, particularly those related to the outdoors, where might be low resource use but maximum well-being as well. And linked to the leisure as well is the whole arts sector as well. Again, we're missing the arts in many ways, but the arts can be a particular focus of the work we're doing in our research centre, because we recognise that not only is the arts a way of articulating an alternative, and sometimes a radical alternative can be articulated through literature, through theatre, through all sorts of other media, but also its everyday participation in the arts is very good for our well-being. So whether it is through singing in groups or participating in music or actually doing art ourselves is having a lot of considerable well-being benefits for many people. The other element that we've looked at in our looking at the multiple objectives within the social enterprise is the consideration of both current and future generations. And I think the future generation debate is taking off at the moment in quite interesting directions. So in Wales, there is a commissioner for future generations, and also attentions to sort of having a future generations bill in the UK, where all interventions in the future or policies and developments should actually take into consideration the views of future generations who may not have a voice now. And in terms of looking at sustainability and equity and well-being, this idea of looking at future generations is really powerful. And many social enterprises have that in a sort of underlying some of their work they're doing, and thinking about the distant others and the others who might not be able to have a voice at the moment. And I think that's one of the challenges that we might be looking at more in the future, is how do we become good ancestors today, so that the future generations actually have a better world in the future. So I mentioned the work we did. This is the work with colleagues with Bianca Stumvickers and others at Social Enterprise UK. It's work funded by Power to Change, where we wanted to look at the role of community businesses, exploring some of the health benefits of social enterprises. The other theme we've done, work that's going on in CUSP, our research centre, is looking at the whole issue of the circular economy, and this is where social enterprise comes in. Some of you may have heard the talks by Adeyemi Adelekan, who's been talking at the conference about his work in the circular economy in Lagos. He's a PhD student as part of the centre. But also we have other projects looking at sustainable fashion, where we can actually find, how do we actually bring the same perspective about having more fun with less stuff when it comes to clothes and fashion. And it's a real challenge there. How do we actually go for new models, not only new clothes themselves and new objects, but actually new services? How can we actually have sustainable fashion that might be more around people sharing clothes, people renting, finding new ways of having clothes that can be mended and adjusted over time. And so we're doing some work looking at the sustainable design entrepreneurs who are actually designing some of these new models and these new products as well across the UK. So it's an interesting area of work looking at how do some of these social enterprises and other businesses bring sustainability in sometimes radical new ways. And linked to that as well as some of the research we've done, we're feeding it into online courses. So we just did one early this year with the Future Learn platform, working with Minka, social enterprise some of you may know, with Sarah Calvo and Andres Morales. And they looking at how do we actually take ideas from academic work related to the social enterprise, the social economy, and related to the circular economy. How do we bring that all together in an online platform and an online course that can actually reach very large numbers relatively quickly? So it's an exciting development for us to see how the research is not just sitting on in journals, but is actually being taken forward in courses and then taken up by people in many countries all over the world. The other work we've been doing in other parts of the world is looking at how this idea of flourishing and businesses relates to multiple criteria models, I call it here. One of the most common ones would be the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a lot of interest in how do we actually take those goals and see how businesses are delivering on those goals. I think to a certain extent, you can see it as a useful tool in that it allows businesses and social enterprises to map out the work that they're doing. But I think we've also got to be a bit careful and critical as well to see to what extent are people just hiding behind particular of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of the goals in the rainbow that they present, a huge number of different elements. And quite often businesses can pick and choose which parts of that rainbow do they actually want to talk about, and quietly keep quiet about the other ones where they're not actually addressing or probably having a negative impact. Some people have called this a type of greenwashing, or it's now being called rainbow washing, where people take the rainbow of the Sustainable Development Goals and just selectively pick what they're doing. Another bit of work that I was doing related to this is looking at alternatives to GDP. And for this, I wanted to work in Bhutan, where they have an interesting innovation related to their concept of gross national happiness, which they've been developing over the last about 30 or 40 years. So this work with Ravsel Dorji looked at the social enterprise models in Bhutan and how they related to these ideas of gross national happiness. And there they have four pillars there of gross national happiness, of looking at equitable social economic development, looking at the environmental issues. Sorry, I think the slides, it's slightly distorted there, but it's preserving and promoting cultural values, and finally good governance. And so the work we were doing there found that the social enterprises in this context, because of that integration and that the discussion around gross national happiness, they brought ideas of happiness and well-being into their organization, and the idea of bringing them together was seen as quite a natural process because of that discourse and the discussion that had gone on related to this concept of gross national happiness at a national level. They were bringing it out in their social enterprises. And this is one of the examples of the social entrepreneurs I was working with there. Mahesh, an amazing potter, but also, you know, training up a lot of the people, training up people, looking at reaching out into unemployed youth. And also he was going about trying to find new materials so he could have local supplies of the clay that he needed, and also developing new artistic forms that actually would take some of the traditions there and take them forward as well. So he was actually having a cultural benefit as well. So as an interesting example, and he is someone who's working very much, you could say, in the informal sector, without a sort of formal organization around him. And it showed this importance of actually how do we look at the nature of social enterprise around the world, that often they're not taking the exact forms that we might expect in that we might find in the West, but we find them in all sorts of different ways when we're looking in different cultures. I won't go through this slide in too much detail because I think it covered a lot of what was in the talk this morning about managing multiple objectives and the idea of hybridity. I think what I'm finding is that we need to go beyond the binary sort of social commercial ideas of hybridity and talk about maybe what I refer to as super hybridity, where you've got multiple logics, whether it's not only the market and social welfare, but also environmental, public sector, faith-based logics. One of the part of CUSP is another PhD student, Ambrose Massakoy, looking at faith-based social entrepreneurs in Lagos. But also we've got to look at the idea of the family logic as well. We find particularly in the work we're doing in Asia and in Africa, the importance of family businesses within the social enterprise themselves. And also the importance of informality as well. So which again brings its own logic as well. So we've got to find ways of how do we bring all of that together. So there's a lot of work we've been doing is looking at the hybridity in organizations, but also we've been looking at hybridity in the innovation process, particularly regarding social innovation. And this is the work we did with Ian Vickers, and Leandro Sepulveda, and Kate McMullen, which we published in Research Policy, was looking at how do we actually, what's the interplay of these logics? We talk about the sort of organizations bringing logics together, But we've been wanting to look at how do we, if we're looking at the innovation process, let's go down to the particular innovation and actually look at how did they actually, what was the interplay of the logic within each of that service innovation or product innovation that we're looking at. And we were looking at health, particularly looking at health and well-being innovations and organizations in the UK. And there we found the three dominant logics were the sort of the civil society logic, the market logic, and then the state and the public sector. In this one as well, when we call a civil society logic, we put environmental logic into that as well. But the importance here was this interplay that the people involved would actually draw on each of the stages of the innovation process, right from the sort of the initial ideation, would again draw on each of these logics. And there, particularly in the UK, where the public sector health services are important, the public sector played a key role in that. So that's why we're trying to look at this hybridity at all sort of, not just the organization, but also down to the sort of process level. So the second area of work I want to look at in the talk today is this idea of flourishing and good work. If we're looking at having a society where people are flourishing and living within their limits, so much an important part of our living is our work that we do. And to what extent does social enterprise provide an alternative view about how people are working, this idea of good work? So the work, a lot of the work we've been doing here is particularly the work with Bianca Stumbitz at Middlesex, and also we're partnering with the organisation Locality on a new project funded by the Power to Change Trust, where we're really looking at what's the idea of good work in these social enterprises, and to what extent is that good work always going to be in social enterprises, or is there sometimes a trade-off between maximising the social or environmental value and then providing good working conditions? Can do organisations sacrifice things? And also, whether employees themselves of social enterprises, are they accepting lower working conditions, like lower salary, things like that, because of the benefits of what we might call meaningful work? And that's where we make a distinction between meaningful work and decent work. You could still, there's some evidence from the initial work we're doing where people will accept short-term contracts, poorer working conditions, just because they want to, they're so passionately involved in the organisation itself. Linked to this idea of good work, and a lot of evidence shows that satisfaction at work is very much linked to having a voice. And we're finding that the voice is greatest in social enterprises, particularly where there's an element of democratising the ownership, having forms of democracy in the organisation. So work we've just been doing, published recently in Voluntas with Leandro Sepulveda and Ian Vickers, looked at this idea of ownership and democracy in organisations. And we found it, in a way, we divided it into two forms of ownership that might be related to good work. So one is the formal and legal property ownership, whether in organizations, that's whether the businesses actually have owners from their staff, also from the wider community. And the second element of ownership is a psychological state of mind related to representation, whether people feel that they have an ownership of the organization, of the issues, and they feel that they know that they can get their voice is heard, and they have a view that way. And in the paper, we actually look at these models and we put it into two axes. One, as you could talk about the actual physical ownership and the ownership of property, and you can go from the inclusive stakeholder ownership on the right-hand side here, where the stakeholders, the employees and others, people might own the organization like you might have in a cooperative. On the other end of the spectrum is what I call stewardship ownership, where people, it might be owned by others who are acting as a steward. So that might be in a social, it might either be a shareholders acting as stewards, but in the social enterprise world, you might have trustees or others who might manage the NGO or the charity on behalf of the acting as stewards. Then on the other axes, we've got the idea of representation. And this idea of the feeling, the culture of having a voice. And so you can have something where a wide range of stakeholders feel included. On the other end of the spectrum is, again, this idea of stewardship, where others who might be the managers or the people running the organization are acting as stewards, representing the views of others. So in a kind of conventional shareholder in many sort of charities traditionally and in many social enterprises, this stewardship model has been often been dominant, where well-meaning people have maybe taken control and not had so much voice to the other stakeholders. On the other end of the spectrum, at this sort of the top right-hand quarter, we've got an engaged and inclusive ownership where people both own the organization and they have a voice. And this is a very strong mutuality that we saw in our study of looking at mutual organizations where they were implementing these sort of democratic governance approaches. As well as that, we also found on the top left-hand corner, we've got what I call as sort of stakeholder psychological ownership, where people might not have the actual ownership. It might be in an organization that has a legal form that doesn't allow that, but there are ways of creating that culture, allowing people to have a say, feeling that they have that ownership of the organization. And that's something where good leaders of social enterprise can instill, even if they can't allow other forms of ownership. Finally, we did find one or two cases, what we called forced mutuality. These were just examples of spin-outs from the public sector, where people might, as they, organizations might have been spun out, these groups spun out by voting to leave the public sector, and the government gave them permission to, and they set up as their own social enterprise. But I think in some of those people, although they voted for it, some people felt they were, might have voted against leaving the public sector. And some people just said, we're not that keen to own the organization. We just want to offer great services. We want to offer really high quality care and healthcare, but we don't necessarily feel we have to be an owner of it. And so that's where we refer to that as sort of a forced mutuality. But that was only very minor cases. So the final section, I want to looking at how does this work that social enterprise is doing, how is it redefining some of the core concepts that we have in the economy and that economists are using all the time. So first of all, we're rethinking the idea of profit and values. It's a long tradition in the social enterprise work of looking at the wider social value beyond beyond the financial value that's that would be distributed as financial profit. In social enterprises as well, the idea of financial surplus is also a bit more complex, because even when there is a profit, so often the financial surplus is ploughed back into the organization. This is a picture of a social enterprise I've been involved in setting up, a nursery. And we found that every time we were able to make a surplus, what we would do is we would put all that surplus, some of it would be set aside just because we might need it for a rainy day or when there was been a problem, but the rest of it would be put back into better resources, increasing the staff ratios so that children could have better, more care and even more attention, and actually going way beyond some of the services that might have been provided by other nurseries. The other area of looking at profit and social and value is this idea of the triple bottom line, And here looking at the whole range of the benefits that we'd get to different parties. It's another, I was conscious of time, so I'll skip over some of the examples I've got from different countries who have sort of been looking at this. But I think the idea of social value actually makes us rethink, what do we mean by productivity? And that's where, if we've got a traditional view of productivity, which is the rate of output per unit of input, the question is, what are the outputs and what are the inputs? It's not just, traditionally, it's the output is seen as turnover or profit of a business, and the input is seen as units of labor. And that's the sort of the dominant view of productivity measures that we're finding in the UK at all, a lot of them at the moment and around the world. But what we're finding is that social enterprises are not maximizing, they're maximizing their social value and the quality of the outputs rather than the profit. And you could say some, such as sort of work integration social enterprises, like this 15 Foundation restaurant, they have explicit aim of maximizing the employment of those previously out of work. So you could say that they would be aiming to reduce their, they wanted to have as lower productivity as possible by these by the traditional measures. But what we need to think about is an alternative forms of productivity that brings in the social value. We need to look at this idea of the sort of the social return on investment. That term is often contested. It's often very difficult to measure. And there's a very interesting work going on at Middlesex with Joe Kitchen, who's here today, looking at who measures the issues of power and trust in that process of how these numbers are used as well. But just bringing in the social is really important. And we're finding quite a very interesting space of redefining productivity is coming up in the procurement system that we've got. And we're finding this across Europe with the idea of social value in procurement, where people are bringing in the social, environmental and economic outcomes into the procurement process. So when people are putting in a bid for a bit of government, for a government tender, there's an encouragement to actually put in the social value as well. And then when they're assessing the bid, they will assess that social value alongside the value for money and the sort of the quality of the services. So this social value might be involving training, apprentices, having extra care, extra services, which is all the things that social enterprises do. So the social value in the bidding process is very beneficial for social enterprises and allows them to really do well compared to other organizations. So it really helps. This reconceptualizing of productivity, I would say, is actually going on. It's become institutionalized. It's become accepted as something that's necessary. What we're finding in the UK is that although there's laws allowing public sector contracts to take into consideration social value, quite often it's only very marginal. It might only be 1 or 2% of the scoring of each of the bidding process. Is still quite small. But it is a start. And the second issue is, even where people have made promises in their bidding for delivering government services, it doesn't always get checked up on later. And it's also limited. We're finding that we're finding it's much more enabled where you have government spending which isn't always in silos. So where people have devolved budgets in particular cities, they can combine health, employment, and social care budgets could all be combined together. So they can actually say, well, let's deliver health, but also use that to address unemployment issues. And so we can combine budgets and the social value can actually be maximized. And this is where social enterprises that want to address these multiple objectives can really flourish. We're going to rethink this. As I mentioned before, we've got to rethink growth. We're not just looking at organizational growth, but social enterprises are looking at scaling up impact and growth, not only through their own business, but through scaling up the business models, looking for that radical change. And I think this, some of the work we've been doing, looking at social enterprise growth, shows it doesn't require organizations to grow. You can have growth through the idea of 1,000 flowers blooming and encouraging lots of different approaches and lots of small organizations to innovate can have a big impact. And that's, we've got to find ways of encouraging that. And in terms of looking at that, can we find these ideas of growth? On the one hand, you can see in this diagram, you have the growth within an organization. But as you scale, if you want to scale up, you can scale up through encouraging even more organizations to do to take forward that social innovation, whether through franchises or licensing. But by far the biggest way of scaling up impact is through open access, sharing and dissemination and good practice. And this is one of the tensions we're finding particularly, and the challenge around this idea of growth is that there is still the emphasis on growing an organization. In a way, by going to the right-hand part of this diagram, by giving away all of intellectual property and sharing all knowledge of innovations, is a way of maximizing benefit, but also you're losing control over how that innovation is implemented. And also you may be losing the income stream that keeps your organization that did the innovation in the first place alive. So again, there's a tension there, a paradoxical position in these organizations about, do they share or do they hold their own intellectual property? If I mentioned at the beginning the interest in this idea of post-growth and degrowth, and here again another bit of work we've been doing with Ellen Stensley and Anne-Laure Humbert is looking at the idea of what types of social enterprise growth would be good for degrowth, because maybe we need parts of the economy that are around healthcare, renewable energy, education. It's all about flourishing and living well, but consuming less. We need to grow those parts of those organizations, while at the same time having a decline in those parts of the economy that might be using most resource. So here we're trying to unpick how do we actually do that, and also looking in there, if we're having a degrowth economy, it needs to be one where there is well-being at work and where the idea of democracy within an organization is crucial. So as organizations grow, to what extent do they actually, are those elements of democracy affected? Finally, when looking at the concept of growth, we need to ask, how do we look at growth in different types and in different places? And on the one hand, we've got the debates around degrowth, around those areas where there's maximum consumption in North America and Europe and in Australasia, and in New Zealand. But on the other hand, we've got the majority of the economy of the world where income growth for the poorest is a crucial issue as well. So we have to find ways of actually rebalancing both within economies of particular countries, but also between countries as well. So the next topic of rethinking is rethinking innovation. The whole conference we've been looking at is looking at social environmental value to be shared. But here we find innovations as that sort of those prefigurative innovations, those innovations that allow us to think, how can we actually think what the world could be like? And that's where social innovation can be particularly important. And again, as I mentioned before, we need to rethink our whole idea of intellectual property to allow that scaling up of innovations as well. Related to that, we need to rethink investment. I'm just conscious of time now, so I won't go into huge detail on that. But again, we've got to find ways of including the social and the financial return. We've got to go beyond the short-term profit maximizing objectives of some finance, and that's where social investment has been particularly useful. There's also really interesting stuff happening regarding fiduciary duty. That's the idea that shareholders or people managing investment funds have a duty to the shareholders. This is called their fiduciary duty, and that's often used as a reason why businesses have to maximize profit. But actually, we can actually turn that around and actually say, as shareholders, as people who might be pension holders or many other groups actually say we don't want to have profit at any cost. We actually want to consider the environmental aspects. And that's where rethinking investment, we can all rethink what is our pension fund doing? To what extent are they meeting the social and environmental objectives that we might feel important for ourselves? And the other important thing in investment is the role of government in addressing the finance gap. And we've found that the work I'm doing with Robin, Owen, Ottmar Lerner, Theresa Hera, and Patrick Elf at Middlesex, where we're looking at, there are those gaps the government is needed to come in to fill, or particularly for that sort of early stage investment for those social enterprises and other businesses, which might have a good idea, they get the initial funding, but how do you actually scale up and grow? It's a crucial problem, and that's why we need the role of government to come in at that stage. We need to rethink enterprise as well. The whole idea of social enterprise is a very radical idea still. It's still a very small percentage. We did a bit of work with colleagues of the European Commission as part of the mapping, as various other people at the conference today were looking at studies in other countries as well. But that really brought home the scale of what we're looking at, and maybe the asset locked social enterprises only at a very small number. These are the social enterprises that have that don't have any ability to share their any profit or assets. We call those the asset lock type ones. In the UK, we might find there's 30 or 40,000 of them. These are important ideas. They're very important social enterprises, and they're driving a lot of innovation. But I think related to that is the sort of wider community, and I think I'll skip over this for time, but I'll focus here on the importance of what I'm calling the purposeful businesses, which are those businesses that state they have an environmental and social purpose, but may not have an asset lock. So they are run as profit businesses that can distribute profit. And here in the UK, we think there might be about 72,000 of them, plus many hundreds of thousands of self-employed people and millions employed. This is a huge part of the economy, much bigger than the social enterprise. And across the world, we find our studies in different countries find that most social enterprises prefer to take this sort of for-profit business legal form, because the other, whether they often there isn't a social enterprise legal form, and the other forms like non-government organisation or charitable forms are quite limiting. So this is the majority of what we're looking at in social enterprise around the world, and a lot of those are in the informal sector as well. So we need to think slightly more differently around where that social value is, where social value focused organisations are, but also be very critical as well, because on the one hand it could be seen as a radical alternative, but other times people are using this language of purposeful business to hide their other less positive activity, and so we need to be aware of the sort of greenwashing, the purpose washing that businesses are using, where they're taking this language to use it to hide what they're doing. So finally, just to conclude, we're looking at the capabilities for sustainable prosperity. It's all about combining the objectives. So we need the people in business, in the social enterprises, who can combine objectives. They've got to be able to find their ways and navigate that, between the tensions. But we also need to find markets and consumers for these new products as well. We need new forms of investment and financial investment. And then also the other skills of being able to kind of bring people within organizations together and across organizations. And then also finally the working conditions there to maximize well-being, recognizing that not only in social enterprises, but in all businesses, our well-being is very much linked to our work. So how do we get the best working conditions? So these are the issues we've sort of touched on as well in another online course, which we're doing with Future Learn, and again with Minka, looking at social enterprise. It's been going several years now, so people interested, they're welcome. We're going to be running that again in the next few months. So people are interested, there might be more there, and some very interesting case studies from some of the work around the world. Thank you very much.